Hi guys, Claudia Boleyn here, and this was not the video that I intended to make today, but over the weekend there has been an absolute media hysteria about Harry and his virginity. So I'm going to put on the screen the front cover of The Sun on Sunday. So this was from yesterday, I'm recording this on Monday. So when you think about all the terrible things which are happening in this world and in Britain itself, all the things that would be worthy of a newspaper to write about on their front cover. Newspaper. Is The Sun a newspaper? I mean, that's up for debate. But right on the cover is a picture of a woman who's come forward, and the headline reads, "I took Harry's virginity." And two massive bullet points on the front. Royal's older lover is Sasha, sex in field behind busy pub. So there's a big picture of the woman who's come forward, Sasha, and then kind of Harry in the bottom right-hand corner. And actually, kind of offensively, in the top left-hand corner, you've got the story, agony of Nicola's partner. So a woman has gone missing here in Britain. So she's a mum, she's got two kids, and she went missing by a river, and they've been looking for her. And obviously, you know, it's a really horrible missing persons case. And the fact that that has been placed in the top left, like it's nothing compared to this, is absolutely ridiculous. Also believe that Sasha has spoken to the Daily Mail. So The Sun, the Daily Mail, we've got GB News here, and this is how they've reported on it. Harry humiliated as older woman who took his virginity says he only lasted 5 minutes. And there's a picture of him with his head down, in reality probably just thinking about something, but as if to make him look small and ridiculous, because it's a whole smear campaign. And I have so many things to say about this and so many thoughts on it. You know, first of all, the hysteria that this is just somebody's life. You know, this is Harry writing about his life. And I am going to get to this. I'm going to read you the passages in question from the book itself if you're someone who's not read it. But to me, this feels like Darvo. It feels like another invasion of privacy, but it's worse than just an invasion of privacy, because once again they're trying to reverse victim and offender, because they're trying to find different ways to somehow frame Harry, who has come out as an abuse victim of the system and of the media. They're trying to now frame him as an abuser. There's also a sort of humiliation tactic which I've spoken about before, which is taking everything he says and putting it under the microscope and basically trying to imply that if they can find anything that's even slightly not correct. I've got another video coming on this actually about some recent magazines that have been out here. But the idea is if they can find anything that isn't quite right in what he's remembered, which in the book I should say he does say that himself. He speaks about how trauma affects the memory, how he's sure some of it doesn't necessarily line up, it's just his memory as he remembers it. But what they do with abuse victims is they look for small insignificant things which actually make no difference. Like in one of the papers which I'm going to talk about in another video, they fact check him on something, like he's talking about being on some sort of games console and he mistakenly says it's an Xbox or something or a PlayStation, I don't know which one it is, and they fact check him by saying, oh, it can't have been that one because that one wasn't out yet. Now, thinking as a normal human being, you would be thinking he's just remembering his childhood playing on a games console. He probably had different games consoles. He just misremembered the one he was using. But they're presenting anything like that as a way to just completely rubbish anything he says. And the reason why we need to look at this, and people keep saying to me, I've had a lot of people saying to me, why do you keep talking about Meghan and Harry? Because, you know, my channel is, it's actually a mess of different things. So it's like mental health, social justice, ASMR, politics, all that kind of stuff. The reason I'm focusing on it so particularly is that, and I've spoken about this before, sorry to bore you, is that what we are watching is a smear campaign in action, and what we're also watching is victim blaming of an abuse victim happening in public, right? So it's offering this opportunity, and I tend to think that it's a horrible thing that's happening, but in order to kind of regain some control as victims and to kind of, you know, not feel helpless when this happens, what we can do is we can use it to educate. You know, we can look at what's going on, we can understand the systems, and we can better fight the systems. So yeah, I mean, the Sun cover, you know, I took Harry's virginity, it feels like a sort of you know, the very notion of taking something as well. I don't really like the phrasing just in general, not to get at her, but you know, it's the phrasing a lot of people would use to say, you know, I took someone's virginity, and I kind of don't like that idea of virginity being taken. And I you know, the very concept of virginity in itself, you know, I don't like the idea of sex being seen as something which is taken. You know, I kind of prefer it to be something that both people kind of you know, consensually embark on and hopefully enjoy together as equals, you know, not some sort of exchange like that. But anyway, so they've named the royal older lover and sex in field behind busy pubs. It's all meant to humiliate Harry, but they do contradict themselves. But I think that's interesting because in smear campaigns they often do. There'll be lots of things that don't make sense if you look at them with rationality and empathy as a human being. But the point of a smear campaign isn't to be consistent. The point of a smear campaign is to just bombard you with as many negative things as humanly possible, even if they contradict each other about a person, and they'll keep coming at you. So the person in the general public who's just getting on with their lives just internalises all of it, right? The idea is, oh, Harry's bad. He's this, he's that. It doesn't matter the things he is are supposedly contradicting themselves, you know. He's bad. That's all that matters. We have to think he's completely bad because we have to rubbish him. We have to know that he's not trustworthy. Sure, he's speaking out against the royal family and the monarchy. Not that he's anti-monarchist, but I don't think it can be denied that the things he is saying about the monarchy reveals a very messed up system. So they've got to do anything they can to discount this man. So they're panicking and they're going for absolutely anything possible. In the Sun article, which I'm not going to read you because it's honestly, I don't want to give them airtime. But they put a picture of him on their article. A picture of him kind of... I don't know how to explain the face he's doing. He's kind of going... That's not a good example of the face. It's kind of like an almost embarrassed sort of oops face. And underneath it says, Harry's book sparked a worldwide guessing game of who took his virginity. And I just want to say, first of all, look at the language there. And it's very victim blamey. No, Harry did not spark a worldwide guessing game about who took his virginity. He's talking about his life that he experienced. He doesn't identify the person involved, and it's like a sentence. It's like 2 sentences, and it's part of a broader piece, and I'm going to read you the context of that. But acting like Harry tried to somehow make this into a guessing game. No, the tabloids decided that this person who didn't ask to be a public figure, who was just born into it, that they're going to further invade his privacy by desperately trying to figure out who the person is. You know, that's not something Harry has done. I mean, if you look at lots of different autobiographies and people talking about their lives, you know, people do talk about how they lose their virginity and their attitudes towards sexuality and kind of how that ties into their lives. Because as an adult, you know, your sexuality and how that started is something you might want to talk about. You might not want to talk about it, but some people might want to. And I've read autobiographies where people talk about this kind of thing a lot more, but Harry really skirts over it, you know. It's kind of a throwaway line, and to me seems to actually indicate that he actually doesn't want to make it identifying. He is aware that this might become a thing, so he just kind of skips past it. That's my interpretation. But you know, this worldwide guessing game, why is that on him? Why is the world taking on some sick guessing game about who took his virginity? Why is that on him? Look at that framing. You know, it's very clear from the book that Harry does not want to be part of this narrative. He does not want to be part of his life, his teenage life, his milestones, his coming of age. He does not want the press involved in that. So them trying to put it on him as if he's setting them clues. Oh, he wants us to look, he wants us to guess. No, he doesn't. He really doesn't. Harry could have put anything identifying in that book if that was something he wanted. He could have named. He didn't do that because he's not trying to identify the person. He's not trying to embarrass the person. He doesn't actually say anything bad or disparaging about the person. And in fact, in the interview, one of the interviews that the woman who came forward actually said, it's very different to what's being reported on. So in her interviews, she's saying things like, yeah, he was a good friend, just a normal teenager. You know, we all kind of hung out together. I don't mind that he called it inglorious. It kind of was inglorious. And she actually says that, you know, maybe at some point we could meet up and have a drink and talk about fun old times. So even that in itself, they're kind of using her because they're trying to make out that, you know, oh, you know, Harry, this awful, awful person. And then what comes out? You know, if the woman who's come forward is the person that's being described, which we don't 100% know, but if it is, she's actually not describing bad behaviour. She's actually describing quite a normal teenage boy, you know? And I think in some ways the tabloids are even disappointed by that. I think they are. So that now they've gone on to that whole, what was this other thing I saw? Oh, the GB News, absolutely ridiculous. And we need to keep an eye on this, right? So the idea that they're mocking him with the fact that, oh, he only lasted 5 minutes. And this is how, especially with male abuse victims, is something they're doing with Harry, we need to keep an eye on. Because what they're trying to do, because Harry is difficult for them to smear because he is quite stereotypically masculine in appearance, and he's, you know, he was a soldier, etc, etc. I think his masculinity is very complex and he provides a real problem for them because he's actually quite reflective and interested in growth and examining his own masculinity, which is a threat. to people who are sexist, which is why you have people now saying that if he has an opinion and he stands up for another marginalised group, that he's now under the control of Meghan Markle, because it's like he's betrayed his masculinity. You know, basically they try and act like he's her puppet and humiliate her, because that's what they do to a male abuse victim. To a male abuse victim who comes forward, they'll try and take away the masculinity element, you know, they'll try and humiliate using that. So what they do with Harry is they often try to kind of liken him to like a tantruming child, like a little boy. They take away his manhood, right? They take away those things from him, to the extent that the worst thing they can possibly get from this woman that's come forward, and we don't know if that's the real woman or not, is that he only lasted 5 minutes. And they're actually mocking that because it's meant to be a comment on his manhood, right? It's meant to be a comment on his masculinity. This is part of the patriarchal system anyway, you know, because you shouldn't really judge someone on that. But what they're trying to do is invade another part of his life. They're trying to humiliate him on a sexual level, right? So they're trying to say, also, you know, you can't satisfy, you only last 5 minutes. I know it's a horrible thing to think about, but that's the implication. That's what they're doing. Well, I mean, that's kind of weird anyway, though, because you're talking about a 16-year-old boy on his first time. So, you know, I don't even think only lasting 5 minutes. I mean, there's no humanity when they talk about him, by the way, because he's just the victim of a smear campaign. You know, I don't want to get into this too much because, you know, the appropriateness of the video, but I don't think that's not a bad thing, you know, for your first time, really. But they're trying to present it as a way to attack his masculinity, right? It wouldn't have mattered if it went completely wrong, right? Normal people, when they get into those situations for the first time, you know, it's not always the best. So they're trying to dig for absolutely anything. And that is a humiliating detail. You know, these are humiliating details the press are putting out. And now what we're predictably seeing over social media is we're seeing people basically humiliating him and laughing about him as a 16-year-old boy. Which is very sick, and it feels very invasive, to be honest. It feels like just another way, you know, I've spoken about how they try and attack Harry using various different arms of attack. So the memory of his mother, they've tried to smear that, and now they're trying to go for his actual sexuality, once again humiliating him in the public eye. And it's Darvo again. So Darvo is a system of deny, attack, reverse, victim and offender. And I'm not trying to suggest that the woman who came forward it's not her that I'm talking about in terms of Darvo. I'm talking about it in terms of the media. So what the tabloids will do, and they'll do this not just to Harry but to other victims who come forward about different institutions or powerful people, is they will take the victim's testimony and they will try their best to reframe it as the victim being an abuser in some way. Or what they'll do is they'll try to find as many flaws in the person, as many bad things about them, they'll dig for things, and they'll bring them out as if to imply that somehow negates their victimhood, right? Which obviously doesn't make sense, because if you're looking at it normally and fairly, that doesn't negate your victimhood, because the idea of a perfect victim is something that really hurts all victims, because the reality is, and people don't want to talk about this, the reality is that victims of abuse, especially emotional abuse, generational trauma, who've kind of lived in a life that's quite isolated, are not necessarily going to seem perfect. In fact, they're going to seem really imperfect, you know. So you see people who've been abused developing really poor coping mechanisms. So they might take drugs, or they might pull away from their friends. You often see, for example, when someone comes forward about being abused, sometimes if it's a media situation, what will happen is the media will go and they'll look and they'll say, look, they don't have very many friends, you know, or they fell out with their friends, you know, that makes them a bad person, it makes them an abuser. But actually, usually in those situations, if you're dealing with someone who's been abused for a really long time, they've obviously, you know, you might have learned love in a difficult way. You might be either too clingy with your friends or be too distant with your friends. It's very, very complicated. You probably won't be particularly great at friendship or forming attachments, or it could be that the friends you have understand the abuse you're going through, but the person who's being abused isn't ready to deal with that, so they push their friends away. And often in a system like this, so for example, the abuser in that situation comes across as somebody who's got a lot of friends, right? They're very charismatic, very popular, because they're very much in control of their reputation and how they come across to people. And this is one of those misconceptions that people have when it comes to abuse. And if we look at, for example, Gabby Petito and Brian Laundrie in the US, where Gabby Petito was sadly killed by her abusive fiance, when the police stopped them, for example, and this is an extreme example, but Gabby was crying and hysterical. Brian was extremely calm and thinking about his image and palling up with the police. So to people who don't understand these dynamics, they're thinking to themselves, wow, this Brian guy is so likable and he's on our level and he's so calm and chill and he's just like one of the guys. That's so great. He seems like such a nice guy. He's so rational. Whereas you've got Gabby, his victim, who is sobbing and she can hardly speak and she seems frail and she seems hysterical and she's lying for him. She's covering things up for him. In some ways, she seems quite childlike. She's not great at advocating for herself in that moment because she's so upset. So people who don't understand those dynamics might look at that situation and think, oh, you know, she's this crazy one. She's so out of control. But this other person, you know, they seem so charming. In fact, sometimes it's the actual imperfectness of the victim which helps you realise who the actual victim is. Because often victims going through these situations don't have the best coping skills because they're going through such extreme abuse. That's why it's so wicked that if these things come out or they go to trial, etc., or the public find out about them, they don't have the tools to understand the system, so they'll often fall for the abuser's tactics of being charming and popular. And they'll look at that victim and they'll say, oh, but when they were a teenager, they maybe slept around, or they pushed their friends away, or maybe they abused drugs or alcohol, maybe they had a bad relationship with their family. Like, and it's just so twisted because, again, I've spoken about this in terms of Harry, how if you are that person, I've spoken about it in terms of the scapegoat in the system, right, in a family system. It's a self-fulfilling prophecy, so that basically the person is abused into a state of not knowing how to handle things and not dealing with things well, and then when they deal with things badly because they're being abused, the abusers can point to that and say, look, that's why this is happening, because they're just so off the rails, they're so difficult. Like, what would you do? It's a really twisted situation. I wish people would understand. So looking at the situation with Harry and the smear campaign against him, I was kind of wondering where this was going to go next. I was wondering where they were going to take this, and I thought, you know what, they probably will go into his childhood and into his teen years, because they're going to try and find something that makes him look bad, which in their minds they can put out there and everyone will say, oh, well, it's even, like, okay, yeah, he's saying he was mistreated, but he wasn't exactly a saint, was he? And they're just efforts to kind of stop us from empathizing with him, or to understand the cycles of abuse and the power dynamics. If people don't understand the power dynamics, they will not see this happening and they will fall for it. You know, they have to try and stop us empathizing with him. And I think this is just my opinion, by the way, as is everything I'm saying on here. I could be completely wrong. But, you know, reading the book, I think Harry took a really warts and all approach. So in the book, he kind of details, you know, I remember he was mocked because people are saying, oh, he's not making himself look great. You know, he's mentioning he did this and he did that and, you know, all these bad things about him. Now, for me, it rings very true, because I think we're dealing with somebody who understands the press, who understands abuse systems, and knows that what they are going to do, the next arm of their attack, will be to dig around and find every single thing that's negative about him to try and make him hated by the public. So I think what's happened here is, I think Harry's thought, you know what, I'm going to lay it all out in my own words, so it's all there, so you can't dig around for it, you can't act like I was trying to hide it. And it shouldn't be that he's even having to do this, but it very much seems to be that he's saying, no, it's already out there, you can't get me for it, you can't twist it, because I have come to terms with it. And I also want to say that, you know, in this kind of warts and all approach in the book, if you're not someone who's read the book, it's not him sitting there excusing all his behaviours. This is somebody who's very aware over time of his own mental health issues because of the abuse and the trauma and the grief, and how he doesn't deal with it very well. He's aware that he's not getting the adequate support, so he's dealing with things in all the wrong ways. He's not, you know, going through all these things like, oh, I'm so proud of myself. He's looking back at this whole system and how it factors in and how it kind of shaped him into that person. He's very reflexive, and he's certainly not trying to present himself as this person that's always right and perfect. It's the complete opposite, in fact. You know, he's trying to detail all these decisions he made and all these the places where he went wrong, the places where he was backed into a corner. He's trying to detail all of that, give us all that context. And what you're actually getting, if you're reading it as someone with a knowledge of these dynamics, is a life of somebody who's gone through an abuse cycle, starts to realise what's going on, and then gets out of the abuse cycle. Also, it's very important to note with these dynamics that Harry is not trying to present himself as perfect. Now, that's what a lot of the media is trying to suggest he's doing. He's not done that at all. It's fine for people to disagree with him or even dislike him, but it's wrong to say that he's trying to present himself as this perfect person who's better than everyone else. He's not. He's consistently saying that he's a work in progress. He wants to do therapy. He wants to learn. He wants to do better. He's constantly trying to fix those generational problems so he doesn't pass them down to the next generation. He's somebody who's very reflective. So, you know, them trying to say, oh, he's trying to show that he's perfect. He's actually not. He's actually making a point to show the ways in which he's really not perfect. And he's just trying to do the work to try and sort things out, you know, because you can see where it comes from. Right, so back to the topic, and I'm sorry this is going to be a long one, but I think it needs to be really got into because of the intensity of this coverage, really. So I'm going to read you the passage about, you know, the virginity issue. And then I'm going to put it into context. So, I suspected he was referring to my recent loss of virginity, inglorious episode with an older woman. She liked horses quite a lot, and treated me not unlike a young stallion. Quick ride, after which she'd smacked my rump and sent me off to graze. Among the many things about it that were wrong, it happened in a grassy field behind a busy pub. So it's very short and it's not identifying. And also, you know, the idea of the older woman. I mean, I think I'm quite relieved if, you know, the woman who's come forward is the woman in the story. It's quite a relief that it's not like a horrible power imbalance situation where you've got like an older person kind of taking advantage of him. You know, that's really good. But also something people are saying, which is quite ridiculous, is they're saying, oh, he calls her an older woman, but she's actually younger than Megan. You know, but I'd think, you know, you're 16 years old. He's writing about it, you know, as if he's the 16-year-old. A 16-year-old, you know, a 19-year-old, he's still at school, he's still at Eton, and she's got a job. She's a 19-year-old girl who's got a job, etc. And, you know, there is quite a difference. They are both young people, and it seems like, you know, they are part of the same circle of friends. But to a 16-year-old boy, you know, an older woman, you know, I don't think it's necessarily that weird. But also, I just want to say as well, they kind of ruined a lot of their own smears against him with this, because on the one hand, they're trying to imply that he made her very identifiable. But I don't think he did. You know, I actually think that reading that, you wouldn't think about the woman that's come forward. In some ways, in fact, it seems like it's hidden her a bit, right? It's very vague. So this is chapter 33, this passage, and it's page 68. And it begins, whenever I was home from school, I hid. I hid in the basement beneath Highgrove, usually with Willie. We called it Club H. Many assumed H stood for Harry, but in fact it stood for Highgrove. So the context of this passage is that Harry is at Eton at this point, and he's under extreme press scrutiny. He's trying to kind of navigate. He's not yet able to deal with the grief of losing his mother at all. He can't talk about it. He's in the public eye. The papers are everywhere. They'd already kind of made some sort of agreement that because of Diana dying, they're not going to harass the boys, but that's kind of gone. They've given up on that, and they are coming for the boys. You know, so the very idea of, you know, whenever I was home from school, I hid. Having to hide. You know, this is a teenager having to hide from the press of the country, trying to find dirt on him when he's just trying to navigate his life. So him and William go to Club H, which is a very ironic name. It's not like a fancy club. It's the basement under Highgrove. And the way it's described in the book, you know, it's actually, it had once been a bomb shelter, you know, so it's kind of a safety place. It's like a safe place where him and William go and they have their friends, and they put some furniture in there and they bring a stereo, and basically it's Harry just trying to take some form of adolescence and some of his teenage years for himself, where he's not being watched, he's not being followed. You know, it's a kid trying to carve out some privacy and some normality, and just try and attempt to be a teenager and just live his life. He and William used to hide out there together, and William used to try and get Harry, when they were there, to kind of talk to him about the loss of their mother, but Harry just couldn't go there. The grief was too raw. Obviously they're grieving it very differently, and he can't really cope with that. So it's kind of like it is a bunker where he goes to just try and get some semblance of a normal life. And just think about it in the sense of an actual teenager. Imagine if you'd lived your teenage years with the world's press trying to stalk you. Okay, so there's this part where it says Club H was the perfect hideout for a teenager, but especially this teenager. When I wanted peace, Club H provided. When I wanted mischief, Club H was the safest place to act out. When I wanted solitude, what better than a bomb shelter in the middle of the British countryside? Willie felt the same, and I often thought he seemed more at peace down there than anywhere else on earth. And it was a relief, I think, to be somewhere that he didn't feel the need to pretend I was a stranger. So he's quite literally hiding out in a bomb shelter, to try and navigate his own youth. You know, a safe place to act out, a place where the press aren't going to be following you. You know, and I feel like a normal teenager, if there is such a thing, everyone's so different, but, you know, your worries during your teenage years would be, like, you know, school, or getting in trouble with your parents or your caregivers or something. These boys are actually, like, having to, like, get into a bunker to avoid that media spotlight, and to try and have some sort of relationship together where it's not going to be commented on by the world. It's their place of safety. He says, and this is after saying that William tries to get him to talk about Diana, but Harry just isn't able yet. One topic that was always safe was how wonderful it felt to be unseen. We talked at length about the glory, the luxury, the privacy of spending an hour or two away from the press's prying eyes. Our one true haven, we said, where those lot can never ever find us. And then they found us. You know, and I think reading that's quite surreal because these are just teenagers. Harry is just a teenager, and he's got to hide from the press. He hides down there, tries to have some sort of relationship with his friends to do normal teenage things, and then they find him. So they've been looking for him. They've been stalking this boy who they've previously kind of had some sort of unspoken arrangement that they're not going to stalk. So what happens around this time is that a man called Marco comes to see Harry there. Also something worth noting is, you know, when they're in Club H, they've got bodyguards, you know, upstairs. So that, yeah, they bring some alcohol down and things like that, but they've got bodyguards. I mean, so there's always kind of this sense of threat outside. Like, you know, we've got bodyguards out there, I guess, in case someone tries to find us. But Marco comes to him, and he's someone who's kind of like a mentor figure to Harry. He's a member of the royal household, and he's come to find out the truth. You know, he's been sent to Harry to find out the truth. So they meet at a cafe, and Harry's actually really happy to see him. He seems to get on really well with Marco, and he's excited to kind of chat with him. He thinks it's going to be a nice moment. But Marco is very serious, and he has to say to him, look, Harry, this is a big deal and I need to find out the truth. So Harry's mind immediately, it's all these parts of the book which are really striking to me, is that, you know, for a moment he forgets his situation and he feels like a normal teenager. For a moment. Because his first thought is, this is where that passage comes in. He's thinking, oh no, you know, they know about the fact that I've lost my virginity. They know about that thing, you know, behind the field, like, oh, and there's also, you know, there's an element, it's not completely normal because there's also the sense that could become public news. It would be seen as shameful. It could go all over the papers. There's a very real threat of that. But for a moment, it's like Harry feels like a normal kid in that moment. He's thinking, oh no, they know about that situation, that inglorious situation. He actually says here, obviously someone had seen us. So he's obviously thinking, oh no, you know, I've brought shame on the family. You know, this is going to be big. This is going to be in the papers. Oh dear. But then he realises that that's not what Marco's getting at. What Marco's actually getting at here, he asks him whether or not he's doing drugs. And Harry's just stunned. So this is the part in the book. It seemed that the editor of Britain's biggest tabloid had recently phoned my father's office to say she'd uncovered evidence of my doing drugs in various locations, including Club H. Also a bike shed behind a pub, not the pub where I'd lost my virginity. My father's office immediately dispatched Marco to take a clandestine meeting with one of this editor's lieutenants in some shady hotel room, and the lieutenant laid out the tabloid's case. Now, Marco laid it out for me. He asked again if it was true. Lies, I said. All lies. He went item by item through the editor's evidence. I disputed all of it. Wrong, wrong, wrong. The basic facts, the details, it was all wrong. So once again, thinking of Harry as a human being, as a 16-year-old boy in this terrible situation, he is now potentially in trouble and having to answer humiliating questions. It's not just the normal questions that a parent or caregiver might ask you. This is an investigation from one of the biggest tabloids. So this is someone with power. This is a tabloid that has the power to put this across the country and make people believe what they're saying. And he is a 16-year-old boy having to defend himself because he's been stalked. And here's the thing, in this passage, the family know. The family know that it's been twisted and that it's just a way to sell papers, right? Because she's done this before. He actually describes it as she was hunting the spare. This part made me really sad. I was lost. For doing basic teenage stuff, Marco? No, boy, no. In this editor's estimation, Marco said, I was a drug addict. A what? And one way or another, Marco said, that was the story she was going to publish. Can you imagine that level of stress and injustice and humiliation and the anger and the pain of being a 16-year-old and having that situation happen? So Harry has to defend himself against all these claims, which is not even the paper's business anyway. And he speaks to Marco about this, and he's upset and he's humiliated and he's scared. And Marco says he's going to do what he can to try and sort it out. What actually happens is that Marco rings him back a few days later and says that the editor didn't believe him. So Marco had told the editor what Harry had said. And again, think about how sick that is, that this 16-year-old boy is having to justify himself and make excuses to this grown woman, right? This grown publication of adults who are hunting him. But they don't believe him. So he's now had to have contact with them. He's had to plead his case, which is humiliating. And they don't believe him. and that they're going to run the story anyway. They've decided they're going to run the story. They don't believe him, and they also don't believe Marco. He has absolutely no power here. He is a 16-year-old boy. And then Harry writes, "Surely," I said, "Pa will do something." Stop her. Long silence. "No," Marco said. Pa's office had decided on a different approach. Rather than telling the editor to call off the dogs, the palace was opting to play ball with her. They were going full Neville Chamberlain. So basically what they decide on, which his dad's office decides to do to kind of get control of the story, is that they think, right, it's going to come out anyway, so how are we going to spin this? So they basically spin it as if Harry is a drug addict, and it makes Charles look good, because he's not really had good press since Diana, and it can kind of be spun by them as, look, he's a really good dad, he's a single dad, he's dealing with this terrible drug addict child, you know, this naughty child of his. Look at him having to put up with that. It makes Charles look good to play into the idea that Harry is a drug addict. Which I just want to say as well, even if he was a drug addict, there's a lot of stigma, let's remember that thing about the imperfect victim, right? There are a lot of people who've gone through trauma and abuse who do misuse drugs and become drug addicts. It doesn't mean they weren't abused, and in a lot of cases they self-medicate on that because they feel completely alone and they don't know what to do, and they're just trying to escape in whatever way they can into their minds. But Harry was not a drug addict. And yet his father was playing the game and letting him be known as that drug addict, basically sacrificing him for his own PR, which is incredibly wrong. It is completely sick. So first of all, if you think about the context of that passage and what it's telling us, the story is basically, to completely paraphrase here, is a teenage boy under extreme trauma, stress, kind of PTSD, fight or flight, because he's being stalked in a very literal sense by the press, the same press that he knows or feels led to the death of his mother. He is trying his best to live as normal a life as possible. He doesn't really know what that means because he's never had it. So he's got like a secret place that him and William have and their friends have, and it's just basically trying to carve out some sort of adolescence, right, where they can't be pried on and they can kind of just be kids. And it is in this situation where, you know, they're drinking and silly that he loses his virginity. It's not something he's particularly proud of, but it also speaks to that kind of the secrecy that Harry lives with in his life and what he has to. It's almost like he's constantly having to take little moments where he's not being watched. To have moments of his own life for himself, he's having to kind of take them really quickly. You know, he's having, while people aren't looking, quick, because they're going to find us. That's the story of his life. So the way it's been positioned by the press and used to mock him, and them acting like it's too much information, they are deliberately misrepresenting the passage, and they have an empathy problem because they're not looking at how horrific so many parts of that narrative are. You know, and I've spoken before in other videos about how sick I find it that people were even laughing about this anyway. You know, it's not inappropriate given the passage. It doesn't reveal any details about the other person involved. When you're reading it in the context of that chapter, even just that short segment, it feels like it's a very tragic story of somebody who's desperately trying to reclaim some of their own life, and that's kind of the story of Harry's life until he kind of, even to now I suppose, that kind of runs through the book, is him desperately trying to have some autonomy and some time on his own, like where he's not being watched, where he doesn't feel under siege, because that's how it kind of reads, that from when he was a child he felt under siege. And of course him now owning his own narrative and speaking about the events and how he feels, we're now seeing Darvo, because now they're saying, oh look, he's owning the narrative, he's like, he wants attention, which is the sickest form of victim blaming, because this is a boy who's been stalked since childhood by that press and abused since childhood by that press. And if people could just step back and think about him as a human being and how messed up that system is and how much it continues to be messed up with the children that are involved in it now, we would realise that what we're seeing is abuse. It's abuse, and we are victimising an abuse victim of that system because he dared to come forward. Because again, he can't win. If he hadn't come forward and spoken about all these issues, what they'd be doing right now is they'd be bringing them up themselves and they'd be using it to discredit him. So what he's done is he's come out and he's tried to be as full and frank as possible, the good, the bad and the ugly, so they can't then say that he's trying to hide things. But the reason I wanted to make this video is because I wanted us to think about this in terms of abuse dynamics, oppression dynamics and smear campaigns, because these are the same techniques that get used in abuse situations in day-to-day life, not necessarily with famous people involved. these are the same tactics. You'll see them in all sorts of abusive and oppressive dynamics. But yeah, that's kind of not the video I intended to make today, and this is really long. So thank you so much for watching. I've had quite a lot of new viewers and lovely comments recently, and I really do appreciate that. Thank you so much. I've had some people ask me about my PayPal. Yes, I do have a PayPal. If you want to like tip me, like buy me a coffee or something, then yes, that is in the description box. You can find that below if that's what you would like to do. People have been so kind, so nice. I'm glad that you're enjoying this content, and I hope it helps in some way. And I'm going to keep going as long as I see this thing going on, honestly, because I feel like if we can document it, if we can look back at it, then we can kind of use it as a learning situation, really, because otherwise I think it's incredibly re-traumatizing for victims, and it helps to kind of come together and see what they're doing here. So yeah, all right, I love you loads. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you really soon. All right, love you. Bye.